Marine, great to see you as always. As Anna mentioned, the subject for this panel is navigating the EU regulatory landscape. We're going to talk a bit about the large number of regulations that are coming down the pipeline in the EU that will impact quite a large range of companies of different sizes and different industries. The format of this panel is a fireside chat. So Marina and I will go back and forth and ask each other questions. And if you do have questions throughout the course of this panel, just as usual, please add those into the Q&A function at the bottom of the chat, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So Marine, let's start with you. We've heard a lot about the EU Green Deal. It's been a major topic of conversation over the last couple of years now, and continues to really be a major focus, not just in government, but across industries that are trying to plan ahead to prepare themselves. Can you talk a little bit about what the EU Green Deal is and where does it stand, as of today, as of September 2023?
Yes, and thank you for having me here. Indeed, the EU Green Deal did do a lot of noise. We keep hearing about it. So to put it simply, I would say the EU Green Deal is a strategy. And the goal of this strategy is to reach climate neutrality in the EU by 2050. And so to reach this goal, the EU came up with a lot of different package of legislative that tackle the need to reduce carbon emission. And so indeed, it's kind of confusing because we hear a lot of different names, different types of legislative, but the goal is to tackle the same problem from different angles. For example, what the EU wants is to rethink the way we produce and to make from the design products more sustainable. The EU also wants to rethink the way businesses communicate to consumers so that consumers are provided with better, more reliable information so they can make more sustainable purchase decisions. And finally, an important point, it's also the EU want businesses to be more responsible and accountable for what they do. So what the EU is trying to do is to force businesses to have mechanism in place so that they conduct, for example, due diligence in terms of their social and environmental impacts. So where does it stand now? It's been going on for the last 5 years, right? And a lot of initiatives have been proposed. Some are still in the drafting stage. Some have already been adopted. And so now is really the last stretch before the European elections in June upcoming. And so it's really kind of the last sprint to get everything out. And to exemplify my points, I'd like to just name 3 very important pieces of legislation that we will for sure talk about. So the first one is the deforestation regulation that you might have heard of. And this one already passed, and I think it made a lot of noise because companies are now gearing up for the implementation of it. The second one is the so-called Corporate Due Diligence Directive. And this one is really in the final stage, which is called the trilogue, final stage of the drafting process, and so soon to be adopted. And then finally, a very important one as well is the forced labor regulation, which is still a bit more early in the process, but that is also doing a lot of noise. So in a nutshell, that's what the Green Deal is. But tell me, I would love to hear a bit more on the US side. Do you face a similar regulatory landscape?
Great question. On the US side, I think most would agree that the EU tends to have a more robust environmental regulations than the US does, or historically that the US has had. But in terms of social due diligence, the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has been a major topic of conversation over the last couple of days of our conference, is really the one of the most important pieces of regulation that's come out of the U.S. over the last couple of years. And there's a number of reasons why it was so transformative. One of the biggest, and arguably the biggest reason, is it did really mandate supply chain due diligence and supply chain mapping in a way that had not existed to that degree before. Forced labor and products made with forced labor have actually been illegal in the United States since 1930. However, there were some pretty obvious loopholes to that existing regulation and that existing precedent. And what the UFLPA really did and how it kind of has transformed things over the last year plus that it has been in effect is it really shifted the burden of proof onto importers. So now the process was no longer that the U.S. government had to prove that forced labor was occurring in order to detain a product at the border. Now that burden is on companies to prove that forced labor is not occurring. And some of that comes from the really specific language in the UFLPA, that rebuttable presumption that products manufactured whole or in part in the XUAR, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, are made with forced labor. And so again, that's really where supply chain mapping and supply chain due diligence became the cost of doing business, a requirement for companies that are looking to import and operate in the United States. Companies need to know where their products are coming from. They need to know who they're sourcing from. They just can't afford to have limited visibility into their supply chain. So, there's absolutely overlap between, for example, the UFLPA and CSDDD, just in terms of the due diligence needed to comply. But I will say that the EU has quite a bit more by way of environmental regulations. The US doesn't have a comparable regulation on the books currently that could compare to, for example, the deforestation regulation. While there are some, laws around illegal foresting and timber. But that is really where the EU stands alone. The large slate of environmental regulations that require companies to look at their risk before products are allowed to enter the market. And I guess on that note, when we talk about these environmental regulations coming out of the EU, are there any consistent themes or requirements across these regulations that you can share?
Yeah, I was even thinking, based on what you said, it seems that the recurring thing is, again, to make businesses more responsible. And for that, I think the starting point seems to be traceability and transparency, really. I think it's the same in the US. Yeah. And I think, the starting point is knowing your suppliers and mapping your supply chain seems to be a good start.
Absolutely. And I would absolutely agree with that on the US side as well. While the UFLPA is such a focus in the US, should there be additional regulations that do require supply chain due diligence, which, presumably there will be, there really are some common themes across all of these. For multinational companies that are operating in the US and in Europe, that are, technically in scope of, the EU regulations as well as the US, potentially Canada, potentially Mexico, some of these other countries that are also instituting similar forced labor due diligence or social due diligence regulations. A really common theme is knowing, who you're sourcing from and from where. So that really can be step one to be able to assess your risk. I think a lot of companies struggle with the concept of, there's competing regulations. There's so many. There are reporting requirements for each of these. They're distinct. They're different. What should be my first step? How do I get started if I have, no visibility into my supply chain past my tier one? Well, there's your answer. You have to have that full visibility into your supply chain to even be able to assess your risk of running afoul of any of these regulations. So that, from my perspective, really is the common theme. Step one, figure out where you're sourcing from and all of the suppliers within your value chain, and also see where you have missing information. If you have, a whole area of your value chain that is essentially a black box, you're not able to collect the information that you need, that is a risk in and of itself. If you have suppliers that are completely unresponsive, that are not providing you with, who they're sourcing from, that is a risk in and of itself. And so that really would be my recommendation as to where to start and to get ahead of some of these regulations that have not come out of trilogues yet, like CSDDD, but may have quite a bit of information that companies would need to collect in the lead up to when that goes into enforcement.
Absolutely, yeah.
So another question for you, Marine, is, as some EU member states already have due diligence obligations in place, how would, for example, an EU directive fit? And I would say probably the first step to answer this question would be, could you talk us through, for folks who are not in the know, what's the difference between an EU regulation and an EU directive, and how might those have different levels of enforcement?
Yes, that's a great question. I do understand it gets very quickly very confusing. So to answer this question, so the EU uses different types of legislative instruments. And the two you mentioned, right? Regulation and directive. So in the case of a regulation, what happens is the EU gives a text to member states, gives a law, and member states have to take this text as it is. You adopt it. End of the story. However, in the case of a directive, what happens is the EU is giving guidelines. It's giving a text that then member states have to transpose into the national legislation. So that does leave a bit of margin of interpretation first, and but it's important to highlight that what the EU gives is minimum requirements. So in the case of CSDDD, for example, which is a directive, the due diligence directive, some countries in the EU already have a due diligence directive in their national legislations. So when the EU laws comes into place and they have to transpose it, it will be minimum requirements. And if the countries goes further, then companies will still need to comply with those stricter requirements. So I understand it gets a bit confusing, but also important to know, in the event of conflict between national and EU regulations, it will always be the EU law that will prevail. There is a simpler rule of EU primacy.
That's really, really helpful as we think about things like the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act and some of the regulations that France has passed over the last year, like AGEC, and how those might factor into the regulations and directives that are coming out of the EU. I know that is a question that a lot of companies have had about kind of which one takes precedent. Should I bother understanding the ins and outs of some of these national regulations when the EU is coming forward with a full regulation or directive in the coming year? So really helpful as companies try to navigate those requirements and those complications.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I'm sure in the US it must be more or less similar. How does it work between the state level and the federal level?
Yeah, great question. For the most part, things are simpler here because, of course, we don't have, when we're talking about national legislation, we're only talking about one country as opposed to 27 member states in the case of the EU. But there are some states that have come forward with due diligence regulations that have been either proposals or ones that have moved forward to varying degrees of success. I will concede that can make things a little bit complicated, because how do you navigate a state law that does not have any enforcement mechanism at the national level? So to give you an example of one that has not fully moved forward yet, but we've been discussing it now for over a year plus, has been the New York Fashion Act. So what this originally had looked like in the proposal stage was to provide some supply chain due diligence requirements for apparel and textiles, so fashion goods entering New York State. Where that can get a little bit complicated is a couple of reasons. So those of you who have traveled to New York or live in New York, as I do, know that New York is a major hub for apparel, for companies in the fashion industry. And so when you really boiled it down, this would be if this were to move forward, this would be a state law that has global implications, because if the requirements are robust enough to cover any company that is attempting to sell within the state of New York, that can make enforcement somewhat complicated. Again, when we're talking about a state law that does not have a national enforcement mechanism. California has many examples of this, where they have moved forward with, for example, environmental legislation that does not have any sort of national, federal enforcement mechanism. So you can see some similarities between the concept of an EU directive, where let's say that at the EU level, the EU is providing guidance or recommendations, and then the member states have some ownership, some ability to decide how they want to enforce these particular directives. There are some similarities in the way that some initiatives get kind of slated to the states, the U.S. states, and there isn't a federal mandate. So it's been really interesting to see more and more, due diligence proposals at the state level. It seems to be the same states that keep proposing these types of regulations. Not surprised to see this coming out of California and New York, but it's definitely something that we're keeping track of, because again, there's global implications when you're talking about apparel and textiles and fashion passing through the state of New York.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You were talking before about the UFLPA, right? And you mentioned that there is the burden of proof is on companies, right? There's a rebuttable rebuttable proof that some products are made with forced labor. And I think it's very interesting because we're discussing it right now as well in the EU. So I was wondering, can you walk us maybe through the differences that you can see between the EU-US regulation around forced labor?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So as of right now, I mean, as you mentioned, Marlene, the EU forced labor proposal is, to some degree in the early stages compared to, CSDDD, as we've discussed. However, as of right now, there's no indication that would be focused only on one part of the world. So forced labor coming from one part of the world. The UFLPA is unique in that, even with the name, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it is a regulation that is specific to forced labor coming from the XUAR, which is a region in China. However, one thing that I just want to make abundantly clear about UFLPA enforcement, and something that we've absolutely seen over the past year plus, has been more products with countries of origin listed as Vietnam and Malaysia are actually being detained at the US border over products that have China as their listed country of origin. And there's a couple of reasons why that's happening. One, the US government has taken note of third country manufacturing, where a product might be originating from one country, but it is being made with inputs from another country or a series of other countries. It's a very common practice. And because of that rebuttable presumption, because of that specific language in the UFLPA, the CBP and the other enforcement agencies overseeing UFLPA enforcement are not just looking at products with China as a country of origin. If they were, they would potentially be missing a large number of products that might have inputs from the XUAR and are therefore in scope of the UFLPA. So that's absolutely occurring. It's not possible for companies to just focus on their supply chain that's running through China to be compliant with the UFLPA. And I know in one of the panels that we had yesterday with Caron and with our founder and CEO, that came up a number of times as a point of emphasis. The companies can't just focus on their supply chain based in one part of the world, even though the UFLPA has a very specific focus. So I would say that's one of the biggest the biggest differences between the UFLPA and the current proposed EU forced labor ban. That the forced labor ban has the potential to be much wider in scope if it's not focused on a particular part of the world or a particular region. And it remains to be seen kind of how detailed that enforcement gets, because the broader the scope, the more you expand this to just forced labor as a global problem, it can get complicated. While it might, do a better job of tackling the issue of forced labor, in that obviously forced labor is not something that is only occurring in one part of the world, in one region. It is a global problem, and frankly, no part of the world is exempt. But it does get really complicated as companies attempt to adopt a risk-based approach, because if they can't, focus their attention on certain areas, it can pose some challenges.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And indeed, in the EU, so far, it remains to be seen what the final text is. But every product for sure is in scope, product and services. Actually, it's in discussion. But indeed, the Commission will be tasked to come up with a ranking system, ranking countries from high to low risks, and also products from high risk products to low risk products. But indeed, any kind of product is in the scope. And it's also interesting to hear that the burden in the US is on the companies, because here in the EU, they still want the authority to be the one responsible to prove that forced labor has been used in the supply chain. So that's very interesting.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the biggest differences as we compare the two. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat. One that I think might be interesting to raise here is, Marin, can you talk a little bit about the EU's digital product passport and kind of what implications that might have? That's been something that, I know we have discussed quite a bit over the last year, and potential implications there for supply chain due diligence. What can you tell us about the DPP?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. So as I was saying before, the EU is really trying to rethink the way we produce products so that we make them by design more sustainable. And one of the aspects they were suggesting for that is that every product will have a digital passport. So in this passport, imagine this like as a QR code that anyone could scan. And when you scan it, you would have a lot of information about where the product is from. In case of clothes, what exact textile it is, how you should wash it, also how it's been made, what kind of supply chain it has. So all information will be in this QR code, but also how to dispose of the product, how to reuse the product, how to recycle the product. So really thinking on giving more information to every actor in the supply chain on how to deal more sustainably with the product. And indeed, because of that, companies will need to collect quite some information to not only to collect them, but to combine them in a very succinct way and make them available to their supply chain and eventually also to consumers. Now, what type of information will be required in this passport, but also who will have access to it, is still in negotiation right now, and we would know more when the final text comes out, which is expected to be this year, by the way.
Great. Thank you so much for walking us through that. A little bit of a follow-up question that I think we can perhaps tag team a little bit here, but something that's come up quite a bit on the side of industry when they contemplate the requirements around the product passport is confidentiality of data and competition. So, if I'm publishing this information, if I'm a company and I'm publishing this information about my value chain, does that harm my ability to be competitive in the market? Can you talk a little bit about, how those concerns have been raised to date? Obviously, we know we don't have kind of a official answer for everything that will be required in the DPP, but any insights you can lend there about how the EU has been thinking about confidentiality?
Yes, and it's been a major topic, and I think the EU is very well aware of the risk and is really taking it seriously. And in terms of actions. So as I said, the type of information that will be required to disclose is under discussion. But also not everyone would have access to all type of information. So some of them would be only, for example, for companies that are made to recycle the products. Maybe they need access to different types of information than people that are just in the supply chain moving the product to consumers. So in that sense, confidentiality is a big topic indeed. It's at the heart of the ongoing negotiations. And I think in any case, it can be preserved while offering more information along the supply chain and more transparency.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I will just add a little bit of context about how we at Sourcemap collect information on the part of our customers. So our customers fully own their data. They are fully in control of their data. If they leave Sourcemap, if they're no longer working with us, their data goes with them. And so we are never sharing information, directly to the government or to any enforcement agency. We are, helping our customers compile that requisite information so that they can disclose it in the required manner. So just a quick note about sort of how we are collecting supply chain data. None of our customers have access to our other customers' supply chain data. That's completely secure. Their data's on their own servers. So really important. The idea of data privacy here is really critical for companies that are aiming to be more transparent in their compliance with these regulations, but also do need to think about remaining competitive and not sharing all of this proprietary information with their competitors. So it's absolutely something that's come up quite a bit when we talk about the DPP and the potential of having a QR code on a product that's showing the origin. It wouldn't necessarily have to have this is the name and address of the supplier that this product came from, or the set of suppliers that this product came from. But that's absolutely something that industry has raised quite a bit in the past. I do see one other question here, Marina. I'm not sure if this is one that you would like to answer, but we've talked a little bit about the German Due Diligence Act, which I will not attempt to say the full name in German. But we're getting a couple of questions here about whether there might be overlap in the requirements for CSDDD and what's being asked in the German Due Diligence Act. I'm happy to sort of kick off the answer to this question in that there's absolutely overlap in just the objectives of these two regulation, or excuse me, this directive and this German act. The biggest is that these are supply chain due diligence. These are two examples of supply chain due diligence legislation. And so both are requiring companies to have a layer of visibility into their value chain, differing layers of visibility, arguably. But again, just to circle back to what we said earlier, there is a common through line amongst all of these regulations. And as a way to kind of boil this down and simplify it is start with understanding where you're sourcing from and who your suppliers are and where they're based. That really gets you, 10 steps ahead in terms of juggling all of these competing regulations. Anything to add there, Marine?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. The starting point of all of that is really to know your supply chain and offer more transparency. Maybe to add a bit of context, indeed, there is this German law. There's also a French law on due diligence. And in a single market, the EU has deemed necessary to have then an EU-wide directive or legislation to address the due diligence problems, which is why it came up with this directive. And to answer the question, will there be overlap? Well, it's the same, as you say, it's the same matter that is addressed. But in terms of real requirements, so far it seems that the EU goes a bit further than the German one. And so companies will need to abide by the stricter rules that the EU offers, because in any case, every member state will have to adopt those stricter rules.
Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about timelines. We mentioned that CSDDD is in the midst of trilogues. The EU forced labor ban is a little further behind there, or a little bit in the earlier stages. But what can you tell us about expected entry into force? Let's start with CSDDD, since we obviously know that they are in trilogues. What can you tell us about an anticipated timeline for when that might enter into force?
Yes, and very soon is the answer. No, to be more precise, so CSDDD is indeed in the final stage in trilogue. They will agree on a text, hopefully soon, and the moment they do, and that the text enters into force, then companies will have 2 years to be compliant. And that's for the first companies that will have to abide by the full obligations. Then for companies that will have to abide by the limited obligations, then they are given 4 years for compliance. So in fact, when you consider the amount of mechanisms that have to be put in place and the amount of things a company needs to trace, 2 years is not that long. And I think that the message is here, it's really important to start as early as possible. But I think you have another advice maybe to share, or it seems to be very urgent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really hit the nail on the head, that because this is the scope is huge. The sooner that you can get started, 2 years will go by just unbelievably fast, especially for some of these giant companies that will ultimately have a huge number of products that are in scope, or a huge number of areas of their business, I should say, that are in scope of the regulation or of the directive. So the sooner that you can identify and conduct essentially a gap analysis as a company. So where am I missing information? What information do I currently have now? Where am I missing information? And how soon do I think I could collect that information at the company level to prepare? The better. Because what you don't want to do is wait until the year that the directive is going into enforcement. So the year that reporting would be due, the same year that penalties would potentially be imposed, and just start then. That will be too late. So the sooner that you can get this visibility and also identify where you're missing information, really the better. On that note, can you tell us a little bit about consequences if companies fail to comply? So, to talk in more specifics, we can talk about the EU deforestation regulation as something that is absolutely coming, and December 2024 will be here, before we know it. What are some of the consequences for companies that are not able to comply, or that are not willing to comply?
Yes, great question, because that's going to be a very important one. So if a product, so there are 7 products in scope of EUDR. If one of those products is found to be non-compliant, is found to have caused deforestation along the supply chain, there are various consequences. Well, the first one being the product will be withdrawn from the market. End of the story. The second one is you would have to bear the cost as a company of what member states and authorities had to invest to prove that the product was not compliant. So authorities will have to do research, will ask you questions, it will take time, it will take a lot of person, and you will have to pay for that. And then finally, in terms of fines and sanctions, it is up to member states to decide what the sanction will be. So this is still to be seen, but just that already is a lot. And then you did mention about non-compliance in terms of CSDDD on the due diligence. And here, well, the final text is not out yet, but what we're talking about is massive. If you fail to comply as a company to implement those due diligence mechanism, the discussion right now is that you would have to pay a fine up to 5% of your turnover. And if you're a global company, that's 5% of your headquarters. Just that is already a lot of money. And then finally, just to come back on forced labor, if again a product is found to have been made with forced labor in the market, it will be withdrawn immediately.
Absolutely, and I do want to touch on something that you noted about the financial penalties. That is one major difference between the UFLPA and, for example, CSDDD and the EUDR. That right now, the biggest financial penalty in the event of a UFLPA related detention is, companies have to bear the brunt of, not the brunt, all of the cost of holding their items at the border as they are being reviewed by customs. And then there's oftentimes a pretty significant financial hit if their products are ultimately excluded, they're destroyed. Some companies ultimately abandon imports at the border because they're not able to provide the information in the 30-day window that they have to respond to CBP. But frankly, one of the biggest penalties of not complying with the UFLPA is a reputational hit. That when it is publicized that a company has faced either faced a large number of detentions, or what is more likely, the company is identified as having some ties to forced labor, the reputational hit can be far more of a penalty than just a one-off monetary penalty. However, the penalties for noncompliance in the EU, as you noted, are pretty significant. Those are big numbers. Those can be very big numbers for companies that are in scope, especially for a number of these regulations. That there could be the potential of stacking the penalties to some degree. I think that is just a really important thing to note, that these penalties can be severe. One question that came through in the chat that I think you mentioned earlier, Marine, but I do want to just give you a chance to emphasize it. A question we have here is, what is the typical or standard time delay between an EU law being passed or adopted and then being enforced? For some of these, we're seeing obviously 12 to 18 months, sometimes more than that. Is there any standardization around, adoption to enforcement on the EU side?
So it does depend if it's a regulation or directive, once again. In the case of a directive, because member states will need to transpose it into their own national legislation, it leaves a bit of time. Usually it's 2 years for member states to adopt it. And in the case of regulation, usually it leaves, in those we talked about, it's usually 2 years left for companies to adapt, implement those mechanisms that are needed, and to be compliant. Marisa, you mentioned UFLPA and the consequences before. I'm just curious, could you give, I don't know, a concrete example on how Sourcemap can help clients become compliant when it comes to UFLPA?
Absolutely. So one of the key objectives that we have when we are working with any customer on UFLPA compliance is to really get ahead of and help them get ahead of any potential risk exposure that they might have to a detention. So we're really adopting a preventative approach as opposed to a purely reactive approach. A reactive approach to the UFLPA would be, you've done nothing, you've done no mapping, and then you get a detention and you need to pull together information really, really rapidly in 30 days to respond to enforcement bodies. That can be really difficult if you have not done any of the work to identify all the suppliers within your value chain, collect some of this documentation on the front end, test your supplier's ability to respond in that 30-day window. That can be just a huge challenge and a huge burden on companies. And oftentimes companies will fail if they have done nothing until they get a detention. So what we're really doing is identifying all of those suppliers within your value chain beforehand. So a preventative approach there. We're conducting risk analysis in a couple of different ways. One is identifying where you're sourcing from, because the UFLPA has this very specific rebuttable presumption around products manufactured whole or in part in the XUAR. So that aspect can be pretty straightforward. But what we're also doing is running the names and addresses of your suppliers against our proprietary supplier watch list. So this is a list of over 70,000 names of entities. Those names are added to our list for a lot of different reasons. There's the UFLPA, official UFLPA entities list, which only has about 20 entities on it. There are quite a bit of public reports of entities that have been accused of having some tie to forced or child labor. Many folks have read the Sheffield Hallam reports, which have a huge number of entities included on them. We're pulling in lists from OFAC, from some sanctioned entities, entities that may have links to terrorism through some of these lists that are published through the UN. So there's really a wide range of risk categories that might get an entity added to our proprietary entities list. And then what we're doing is, as your suppliers are being discovered throughout our process, we are running their names and addresses against those lists. And so that is a really great way to get ahead of a potential detention. So let's say, and obviously I will anonymize this example, but this has happened. Let's say a company did not have full visibility into their supply chain and all of their suppliers that were contributing to the production and manufacturing of a particular product. They are identifying all their suppliers through our system. We're running their names against the supplier watch list, and lo and behold, they get a hit on the watch list. So one of the suppliers that they are sourcing from has shown up on one of these lists as having ties to forced labor, child labor, et cetera. This is before a company has received a detention under the UFLPA. And so now they have an opportunity to make appropriate procurement decisions, stop working with that supplier, and make sure that their value chain is forced labor free. So this is really an important way to comply with the UFLPA, to adopt this preventative approach as opposed to waiting until you get a detention and then trying to put all of these processes in place. It is very, very difficult to get all this information in 30 days if you have not begun the process well before that.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
So I know we're coming up on time here. What I'd love to do is maybe talk a little bit about what we expect going into 2024. We know that this is an election year for the EU. It's also an election year for the United States. Anything you can share, Marine, about what you anticipate coming out of the EU in 2024?
Yes, so I would say we're still hoping for CSDDD, for example, the due diligence directive, to be finished before the elections, as well as false labor regulation. But should it not be the case, what will happen? Well, what happens is the file is then given to the next legislature, and the next parliament can decide whether it wants to continue the discussion, continue discussing on this text, or it asks the Commission, the other EU body, to present another text. That's up to them. That's a decision that will be taken after the election. I think supply chain transparency is remaining a big topic. I think there is really big pressure from civil society for more responsible business practices. This being said, I also think it's important for some parties within the EU to keep an eye on the business competitiveness as well. And here I'm mostly thinking about SMEs and how we can better help them implementing those mechanisms, having those reporting in place, because of course for them it's a higher financial and administrative burden. And so the Commission is, for example, thinking of issuing some guidelines on how to better help those SMEs being better compliant. But in the end, I do think that transparency, traceability will remain a massive topic.
Absolutely. And thank you for walking us through that, Marine. On the US side, and this is, I'll partially answer one of the final questions that I see here in the Q&A. about some of the motivation for these regulations, whether they are, purely focused on environmental and human rights objectives, or whether there's also some geopolitical pressure incorporated. The answer to that is absolutely. I think on the U.S. side, there are, supply chain due diligence is one of the few bipartisan issues in the U.S. that remain. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, supply chain due diligence allows us to, prevent products that are made with forced labor from entering the U.S. But the other reason is, understanding who you're sourcing from can be a matter of national security in the U.S. If you have products entering the country where companies have no visibility into the origin, that can be a security risk, and so there's other motivations to mandate supply chain due diligence. There's also motivations to incentivize doing things responsibly, and some of that is ensuring that supply chains are resilient. Supply chains are able to properly respond in the event of a disruption. We all went through the height of the COVID-19 pandemic at the start of 2020, the massive shortages that occurred at the beginning of the pandemic, frankly, made supply chain issues kind of a household conversation. Having worked at Sourcemap, obviously, I've been talking about supply chain for years now. But in regular conversation, that was definitely not a huge topic in America until the COVID-19 pandemic. And now everybody was worried about these shortages, some of them for really critical products, and even for things like the COVID-19 vaccine. So, there are a lot of other use cases where supply chain due diligence can get you a really critical layer of visibility. And I think on the US government side, they're not just focused on, the identification of social and environmental risk. Well, that absolutely is a motivator. There are other motivating factors, and I think legislators are well aware of the types of information that you can glean when you have that layer of visibility and why that's so critical.
It's very interesting. And also you mentioned in the US context, the problem of COVID. And I would say in the EU, we also have the war in Ukraine, which created even higher pressure to have a better visibility on the supply chain and where also raw energy is coming from.
Absolutely. So we have one final question in the chat here that I want to make sure we address, since we did mention that we're coming up on an election year in the EU. Is there any worry about CSDDD negotiations being impacted by the election, and what can we share there?
It is a big file that is negotiated at the moment, right? It is an extremely complex one with very diverging interests. So which is why the negotiations are going slow, which is why some actors fear they might not reach an agreement before the elections. It is a true risk. Should it happen, it will simply be passed over to the next mandate, to the next commission. And I would also say, so we have a rotating presidency right in the EU. Now Spain has the presidency, and then as of January will be Belgium. Belgium will soon issue their priority, and we think they're gonna include CSDDD, reaching an agreement for CSDDD as their priority. So there's still hopes that this will be concluded, and if it's not, well, it will just be delayed, but for sure it will remain a topic.
Thank you for that. I think that's a great note for us to wrap things up on, just to sort of offer some concluding thoughts for folks who stayed with us for the duration of this panel. There are no shortage of reasons why you should start mapping and monitoring your supply chain. Particularly for large multinationals that are operating across the EU and in the US and around the globe. So this is continuing to be the way the world is moving. Supply chain due diligence is continuing to be, the cost of doing business for companies. And these requirements will only continue going into 2024 and 2025. So the sooner you can prepare yourself, the better. The sooner you can, identify those risks and identify missing information, the better. Marina, I want to thank you so much for chatting with me today. This was a great conversation. I hope folks in the who were dialed in got a lot out of this. If you have any questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today, you can always send an email to info@sourcemap.com, and we're happy to answer any additional questions.